So for this presentation, I will be covering substance use and eating disorders. So the way that I'm going to move through this presentation is talk a little bit about eating disorders. I'll talk about anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. Then I'm going to go into substance use associated with each eating disorder. Then moving into treatment, so what specifically is out there, how to treat co-occurring eating disorders and substance use disorder, and then concluding with what we found in the presentation. So eating disorders, and the thing about eating disorders, they're characterized by different things. So if we're looking at eating patterns, right, it's in the name. So maladaptive eating patterns. So this might be more or less than what that person's average eating intake is. There might also be some maladaptive thoughts about eating. Even further, there might be some difficult emotions associated with weight in eating, depending upon the disorder. When it comes to thoughts and emotions, the content of the thoughts are going to be a little bit different. Same thing with the emotions. So if we're looking at someone who has anorexia, their thought patterns about eating might be related to lack of eating. And the emotions typically associated with anorexia are fear or anxiety about gaining weight. So maybe one thought could be, I don't want to gain weight before anorexia. That's just an example. And with bulimia and binge eating disorders, what we have found is that when it comes to these difficult emotions, there's a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, might be some compulsivity as well. So just to be aware about that, when it comes to certain eating disorders, there are certain emotions and thoughts that you might want to look for. And of note, lack of awareness, lack of insight. This one is really important because for folks with eating disorders, there isn't that awareness or insight to their conditions. When we're looking at eating disorders as a whole, we have noticed that there are some differences. When it comes to gender, what we have noticed is that when it comes to people with eating disorders, they are more likely to be women than men. Now, that's not to say that men don't have eating disorders. There's the chance that there might be some underreporting. And of note, some research has pointed out to differences in manifestation of eating disorders in men and women. So when we're looking at the expectations of weight between men and women, it's different, right? So for women, we tell women they have to be thinner in certain areas. So women with eating disorders, their thoughts, their eating patterns and emotions are going to be more so about weight loss. Whereas with men, the expectation of weight for men is that they become bigger, they become muscular. So the manifestations of eating disorder within men might be towards their patterns, their thoughts, their emotions might be towards weight gain. We have noticed some racial differences as well. When it comes to specific eating disorders, we've noticed that it's more prevalent in one racial group than the other. So for anorexia, it's a lot more prevalent in European white women in US America or within Western countries. And when it comes to bulimia and binge eating disorder, it's a lot more prevalent in women of color, people of color. With eating disorders as a whole and their symptoms, they typically go untreated. And the reason being is for resistance. And well, this is one of them. So with resistance, what we have noticed, folks who have eating disorders, uh, because of the lack of insight to their concerns or to other people's concerns about their weight, um, they typically don't see that anything is wrong with what they're doing. And that makes it a lot harder to treat. So when folks who have eating disorders and eating disorder symptoms go into treatment, there's typically the denial um, that there's a concern. Now, what we have noticed when folks do go to weight loss treatment, their symptoms do go addressed. So when folks with anorexia and bulimia and binge eating disorder, they go into weight loss treatment, um, their thoughts, their eating patterns, and their emotions around eating are addressed at the same time for this treatment. So while in some cases they may not lose more weight, but they come out with a healthier sense of eating, how to eat correctly, how to eat right, and maintain the image that they maintain the body image that the body that they want. So in weight loss treatment, it just gets addressed there. Another one, lack of urgency. So folks with eating disorders, they may not believe that there's an immediate problem. If they're not dying, it's not a problem. So taken together, if there isn't any threats of death or any threats of health problems, then folks with eating disorders are less likely to go into treatment. With eating disorders, there is comorbidity with other psychological concerns, one of them being anxiety disorders. Some research does suggest that certain eating disorders like bulimia uh, co-occur with specific anxiety disorders, such as obsessive compulsive disorder. Uh, some folks are suggesting that for folks with bulimia, because there is this association with compulsivity, they're suggesting that eating might be the compulsive behavior. So the binging might be compulsive. But right now, the research isn't really clear on that. Right now, it's just linking the two together. Post-traumatic stress disorder, with the research that we have, um, folks with eating disorders, they do report PTSD symptoms. Some report histories of trauma and in turn, PTSD symptomology. Self-harm is also comorbid with psychological concerns. And for the specific parts of this presentation, substance use. Um, so Cran suggested that there is a connection between substance use and eating disorders. So in the study, women who had eating disorders were more likely to report greater alcohol and substance use compared to women who did not have eating disorders. And women with substance use disorders were also more likely to report disordered eating patterns compared to women who did not have substance use disorder. So taken together, when we're looking at substance use disorder and eating disorders, we have research to show that they do co-occur. So now we're going to talk about anorexia. Anorexia, the DSM is pretty straightforward about the symptoms for anorexia, right? So restrictive energy intake, they're not eating a lot, significantly low body weight. So when we're looking at body weight, this is smaller than the recommended weight of that person. So I have on the right two pictures of young women with their ribs. Well, the middle picture, the left picture, you can see her ribs. The other picture is of Eugenia Cooney. Eugenia Cooney, if you are not familiar, she still is a YouTube star. When I was growing up, Eugenia Cooney was extremely, extremely thin. You can see her bones in some videos, and a lot of folks a lot of her fans were reporting concerns about her weight, about her eating. She did open up about her eating patterns for a time. However, in some of the videos, she made sure to tell her folks, her fans, that she was fine. Um, so talking about Eugenia, uh, there is, when it comes to anorexia, there is a lack of insight about their condition, um, as well as disturbance in how like their weight and shape are experienced by other people. Another thing that characterizes anorexia is this intense fear of gaining weight. So taken together, that's how anorexia is characterized. When it comes to anorexia, there are two types. You can have the binging and purging type. So this specific type, this is where you have the periods of restrictive eating, and you also have the periods of binging and purging. The restrictive type is where it's more of the restrictive nature of it, right? So extreme restrictive eating intake. When it comes to anorexia and substance use, folks with anorexia are less likely to report substance use, so it's less common with folks of that eating disorder. Of note, when it comes to the specific types, it actually is more common in folks who have the binging and purging type compared to those with the restrictive type. So people with the binging and purging type, they're more likely to report alcohol use and drug use, such as cannabis, sedatives, and cocaine, compared to those with the restrictive type. So taken together, for folks who are a lot more restrictive uh, of their eating habits, and their patterns, what you see is they're less likely to report substance use, um, and and it depends on the substances. According to some research, if it's substances that is used to maintain appetite, uh, and when I mean maintain, suppress appetite, they're more likely to report that use of that substance. But other than that, if there's a substance that is more likely to going to increase them eating, they're less likely to do that. So bulimia. Bulimia is characterized by binging and purging behaviors or compensatory behaviors. So with the binging and purging, they're recurrent. Um, with the purging behaviors, this can include excessive exercise, vomiting, misuse of diuretics, laxatives, and other medications, and fasting. What's also characterized in bulimia is the self-evaluation. So how a person perceives themselves is influenced by how they're shaped and their weight. It's really important in the case of bulimia that the disturbances don't occur during episodes of anorexia, because in that it would be anorexia with binging and purging type. And we do have research to show that it is comorbid with other psychological disorders as well. So bulimia and substance use. What we have found is that it very much is associated with substance use. Folks with bulimia are more likely to report substance use compared to people with binge eating disorder and anorexia. Some researchers have suggested that there are possibilities that the similarities between the two occur in development. So Carbaugh and Sayas, they documented research that looked at the comorbidity and the exploration of common pathways between bulimia and substance use disorders. And what they found was that developmental issues related to societal expectations, personality traits, and family history characterize the similarities between between SUD and bulimia. It's also important to note that there has been some research that looked into um, neurobiological changes and common neurobiological pathways between the two. So Haddad and Naxet, they looked into the literature that examined non-human animal and human studies, and what they found was that within folks with bulimia, there was an increase in dopamine and within the nucleus accumbens. And we know the nucleus accumbens is associated with rewards, right? We've also noticed that there were changes in the expressions of glutamate receptors and in the prefrontal cortex activity in humans with bulimia. And also with that, in non-human animals, after sugar binging, we've also seen alterations in the expression of glutamate receptors in the PFC activity. And these changes and these increases, they're comparable to the effects of addictive substances. They did make note that there were differences. They noted that the changes in dopamine bindings in the nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmentum area, and the efficacy of the drug treatment that target glutamate are different. So taken together, we have seen some common neurobiological pathways between SUD and bulimia comorbidity, and that research is slowly growing. So taken together, folks with bulimia are more likely to report substance use, alcohol use, sedatives, and stimulants taken together. Not taken together at that moment, but just taken together. Folks with bulimia, they report different uses of different substances. Binge eating disorder. So this is basically recurrent eating. So the person is eating more than their average amount, and there isn't any compensatory behaviors. I say there aren't any, but there is actually little to none. It's also characterized by marked distress, so they have to be experiencing some form of difficult emotion. And typically this is shame or guilt. We do notice that it occurs in younger adults, specifically college-aged women, and it is comorbid with other psychological disorders and some physical health disorders as well. They may report, typically, folks with binge eating disorder, they are more likely to be obese, and also more likely to report hypertension. We have seen comorbidity with binge eating disorders. As far as the prevalence rate goes, one study found that about 24.8% of folks with BED reported SUD in their lifetime, and about 2.7 reported SUD currently. So we do have some research to suggest that BED and SUD are co-occurring. Some research suggests a possible overlap. When it comes to folks with binge eating disorder, we also see the same neurobiological changes as I mentioned earlier. Also, some parental history is really important. They found that folks with BED, they reported that their parent used substances, and they also reported using substances. So now we're going to talk about treatment. And something that I found really alarming is that there is like little research on the co-current treatment of EDs and SUD. So when we're looking at anorexia, there is like little to none treatment. And this might be due in part that folks with anorexia, they don't report as much substance use. And it's important to note too that there is emerging neurobiological research that um, that is helping folks to target treatment for folks who have anorexia and SUD. But of note, to find research on treatment um, for folks with anorexia and SUD, it was extremely, I'll be frank, it was nuts. Now, bulimia, on the other hand, there are a lot of, we do recognize that there are some treatments out there. Um, so Strasser and colleagues, they did this study, and what they found like there were similar treatment outcomes among patients who had substance use history compared to those who didn't. So we know for folks with bulimia, they do experience change as a result of treatment. Now, the specific treatment varies. What we have so far in research is that CBT and CBT variant, as well as DBT treatments, have been effective in treating folks with bulimia. We do see like um, reduced disordered eating, improved thoughts about eating, as well as lower substance use. With BED, very much the same thing. CBT and CBT variant treatments, specifically mindfulness. Um, so Corbasan and colleagues actually found that folks with binge eating disorder were, when they got to treatment with mindfulness-based CBT intervention treatment, they reported less binge eating and disordered eating patterns, um, less depressive symptomology, and less substance use severity. With DBT, they found something very similar, um, and of note, improved mood. So taken together, when we're looking at treatments for eating disorders, um, folks are recommending CBT and CBT variant treatment, as well as um, DBT treatment for folks with eating disorders. So conclusion, what have we learned today? We do know that eating disorders and SUDS, they co-occur, right? But we notice that they are more likely to co-occur in people with bulimia and binge eating disorders. When it comes to recommended treatment for concurrent treatment, CBT and DBT seem to be very helpful for these clients. And I do want to point out, there does need to be a little bit more research on several different things. Um, Eating disorders and SUD co-occurring as really, really important. Of note, also important to look at eating disorders and SUD in male populations as well as in racial populations. Well, I say that eating disorders and SUD in minority populations. So not just racial populations, also in the LGBT populations, transgender population, so forth and so on. And also we need more treatment on eating disorders and SUD. So that's it for this presentation.